Welcome to this new episode where for the first time we move from the general level into the specific area of construction law. And we're still focusing on the formation of the contract. Today we will look at the formation now of a construction and landscaping contract as it is. So there's a lot to cover. Basically today we are addressing the public procurement system, which is the method of entering into construction contracts by the public sector. But these methods are used widely also outside in the private sector. The core in this system is the Public Procurement Act, which is actually a European instrument. So the same rules govern these contracts all over Europe. And not only construction contracts, also contracts about procurement of everything else in the public sector. Then we have also here in Denmark, for smaller contracts which fall below the threshold of the Procurement Act, we have the Tender Act, which is about construction. Basically here in the curriculum, it is about the Tender Act. And so that's the main thing for this lesson. We will touch a little bit about the Procurement Act, but basically there isn't much difference between the two except for the threshold values of regarding the contract. Of course, there are some other requirements about the publication of the tender when it is at the European level and so on and so forth. But more or less all the principles are the same. Compared to the Contracts Act, which we've covered so far, here still the Contract Act is in motion, but the conditions here are a little bit changed, because here it is the buyer, so to say, the client, or also called the employer, the one who needs the construction work to be done. He will or she will put out a tender. So rather than waiting for someone to offer something to you, you address potential sellers, the contractors here, and you ask them to provide offers to you. So that's the basic, that is what a tender is that you ask in a public manner and on even terms that various bidders, offerers, that they will submit offers to you, and you can then make a choice. In return for this, you promise that you will, according to the requirements of the tender, that you will enter into a contract with one of these offers. So there's a certain gamble in this, you might say, on the side of the offerers. So of course they will compete about making the most attractive offer in terms of price and or quality. That's the whole idea actually. The tender gives the client something to choose between, and it creates this competition between the offerers, ensuring that the client will get the most for her money. The system actually is created to ensure a number of different things. Basically, that in the public sector, of course, we need it to be very objective what goes on. So in order to ensure that the public sector doesn't waste taxpayers' money, this by granting jobs and contracts to family members and friends of the politicians and decision makers, this system is put in place to guarantee that there's a fair allocation of contracts from the public sector. So it is said here that the desire here is for transparency and equal treatment, strengthening competition in the area, promote development towards better and cheaper construction, which is a result of the competition, it's supposed to be, and a desire to ensure companies a fair and equal opportunity to enter into this market and be granted these contracts. So that's the background for the whole system here. To create competition. The idea is, and many analysis has shown, that Danish construction hasn't had the growth in efficiency that we've seen in other areas of business. Far from it, actually. And also Danish construction is quite expensive, one of the most expensive in the world, actually. So even though these systems are in place, maybe there are still a few things that could be improved. The tender law applies to obtaining tenders for building and construction contracts defined as, and now we come to the kind of the various formats of the contracts which this is about. Execution, that is specialty contracts or direct hire, where you hire a painter or carpenter to do a specific job. Then there are the main contracts or subcontracting, where you have a contract with a contractor, and this contractor will hire subcontractors, the painter and the carpenter and what else. So here you have typically, maybe this main contractor can carry out all the jobs, but probably not. So here we have more likely a two-layer system. And then we have the turnkey projects, also known as engineering, procurement and construction contracts, where the contractor also does the whole projecting, does the design and all the technical development in the project. Also the law regulates the award of the contracts, but not, and that's of course important always to note what's covered and what is not for the purchase of materials or consultancy services. Consultancy service and materials would, in some instances, fall under the Public Procurement Act, and we will return to that probably in another episode. Then we have some of these definitions about what is the projecting, design, engineering. Refers to the preparation of the plan for the works, including technical and architectural design. So in this manner, some of these tasks, which are normally carried out by consultants, engineers and architects, when they are carried out by the contractor in a turnkey project, they are included anyway. So there's a little bit ambiguity here perhaps. Execution is the implementation of the plan, the building work itself. And of course the award rules regulate how, on the basis of the tenders, the contract is awarded, on what terms, how the procedure reaching that conclusion. And as you will see, everything is about transparency. Everybody has to be can assure themselves that this is being conducted in a fair and orderly manner. Otherwise, the contractors wouldn't bother. So the various forms of contract describe the tasks that are offered under the law. So we have the professional contract, as we touched upon briefly before. It's you hire a professional or a professional company within probably one or two branches of construction, as a carpenter, a mason or whatever, and he's hired directly by the client, and if he has problems, then becomes the problems of the client. Whereas when we move to the main contract, we have this main contractor, and he becomes a sort of a layer between the client and the professional contractors underneath, the subcontractors. So if one of these is delayed or he goes bankrupt, he makes a lousy job, then that's the problem of the main contractor, not the problem of the employer. And then, of course, the turnkey contract. So who's obliged according to the Act? Because, as I said, in the public sector, they are obliged to do this when it falls within these frames. So who is that? Well, it's state, regional, municipality authorities, also companies, otherwise normal companies, if these are owned in whole or in part by these authorities, then they will also have to follow these rules here. And also clients who receive public support, including guarantees. So sometimes it may prove difficult to define exactly who may be covered, but to the broad understanding here, these are public authorities. Also, contractors here, subcontractors, or rather the main contractor or the turnkey contractor, when they subcontract, when they have a job for the municipality or for the public sector, when they subcontract, they also have to follow these rules. And then also private parties who are otherwise not covered, not obliged, they can make a bid according to these rules, and in this bid they will commit themselves in whole or in part to follow these rules of the Tender Act. So, and that's widely used, as I said, especially for larger construction jobs in the private sector. Also, you would do this simply to ensure that you get a fair price. Here are the thresholds. As you can see, the contract size, if it's below 300,000, there are no requirements towards these public sector clients. If it's between 300 and 300,000, 3 million, then you have to offer an informal bid, public or limited tender. But if it's above 3 million and up to these 41,305,000, which is where the threshold moving into the Public Procurement Act is, for this large portion of contracts, it is only public or limited tenders which will do. So here you cannot make the informal bids. So tenders are obtained by one of these three methods: public tender, limited tender, or informal bid, which is strictly speaking not a tender at all. An informal bid is where you ask, a couple of maybe 2, 3, up to 4, as we shall see, contractors to give a bid, and then you select one of them, more or less, as we shall see. So it is a little bit like the limited tender, where you invite some, but you have these limits. You can only do it below the 300,000, and also you can only invite 3. And if you take 1 from outside the local area, you can have 4. Private clients are not limited by these, of course. They can do as they like. The concept of the tender is in the Act's Section 4, and it explains what I've tried to describe here, that you offer or you invite offers from the contractors, and you have to provide them, of course, with the same time frame for making the offer, and give them the same information about what it is you want to buy. So by the tender basis, as said in the Act here, are common minimum requirements, is meant that, of course, all the contractors must have the same starting point developing their offer. So they get the same information all together. If there are any changes in the information during the bidding period, this must be submitted to all the contractors who are in play, and so on and so forth. The minimum requirements refers to the Turnkey project, where detailed plans are not even created yet. It's so you have these minimum requirements. We want kindergarten to hold 150 children, so on and so forth. maybe you have a plot of land where you want this built, and then it's up for the turnkey contractor to develop the project based on these minimum requirements. Of course, goes a lot further than what I just mentioned. The offer is binding is not new to us. So the offer is binding, and in the process here, the client will require that the offers are binding for a certain period of time, that the acceptance period, that the deadline has a certain length in order for him to consider afterwards, maybe enter into negotiations with some of the contractors before he finally makes his choice. So he must, of course, accept in time and in accordance with the offer. It's a bit different when it is about what is called here in the Act entering a committed collaboration, which is actually partnering. Because in a partnering, also here there isn't isn't sufficient grounds to make the offer at this point in time. The partners themselves are to develop a lot of this ground material, and then once the work commences, at that time they will commit themselves. So in the meantime, they can leave the project. Partnering is, if you're not aware of this, is a special way of administering, you might say, or managing a construction project, where you make kind of common incentives for all the contractors on the job in order to create a better environment for them to collaborate simply. So if the various stages, if they finish at time or before time and below cost and so on and so forth, they will be rewarded. So it gives them the incentive to communicate and work together in order to achieve these goals. So the public tenders can be, well, publicly announced, or it can be these restricted tenders, where a request, either with or without pre-qualification, is made directly to the tenderers. So in this case, with the restricted tender, the contractors, you have some contractors which you will simply invite. Of course, they are not obliged to offer their bids, but they are invited to do so. And there may be, as it says here, a pre-qualification. Pre-qualification means that in order to be allowed to submit your offer, you have to document that you fulfill certain requirements regarding your capacity, the quality of your work, also your financial solidity. So this is to ensure that the project will be carried through in an orderly manner. So there may be, you might say, two stages here. You have in the restricted tender, the pre-qualification, then you have the tender afterwards for those who've passed the pre-qualification, who were invited for that in the first place. Whereas the public tender, it is announced widely and anyone can make a bid. In the public tender, the advertisement must, of course, mention the award criteria, which may be either the lowest price or the most economically advantageous offer. And we'll discuss briefly what that means later, and also the nature of any information and documentation that the client may wish. So that's part of the tender basis, the tender material. In the limited tender, more or less the same. The maximum number of bidders, because when you're invited, it's nice to know how many will you be competing with. Now to the award criteria. Unless the client cancels the tender, we'll come back to that, in which case the cancellation must be justified objectively. He must, of course, explain why he can't carry through anyway. It is, of course, part of the incentive of the contractors that they know that a contract is going to be awarded. If it's maybe not or maybe so, the incentive to do the huge work and preparation to prepare the offer, if you will do that. So that's the balance here, all that is in the background of this. The lowest price, of course, is lowest price plus capitalized conditions. I will come back to that. The most economically advantageous offer is where there are a number of sub-criteria, which is also taken into account here. And this may be that there are some architectural qualities to the project, and also has to do with a wider economic scope, one might say. How is it cheap or is it more expensive to maintain and operate the building, the construction afterwards? This is some of these things which goes into this evaluation of the economically most advantageous. So it's a wider evaluation than just the price. Now, the tender can be rejected if it is overwhelmingly probable. So it has to be quite clear-cut that the tender is unable to carry out the work with regard to quality and soundness. There's also something called alternative offers, and these are offers which in specified and significant respects deviates from the client's tender material. So here the contractor has sort of come up with his own ideas in order to improve the project, we might say. And the client, he can invite this. He can say, well, we would like to invite also alternative offers, but there are these main characteristics which we will not deviate from. If the client doesn't want it at all, he can state that also. So the informal bids, if it's not a tender and it's not a framework agreement tendered out, then it is an informal bid. As I say, you ask a few contractors to give a quote on a specific job. Once the client has received the tenders, he must consider whether he wants to cancel the tender, for which he needs to give a good reason for that, as I said. And also the same goes, of course, for informal bids. If he chooses not to cancel the contract, which of course is the normal procedure, the contract must be awarding according to the criteria specified. When it's the lowest price, the client is only permitted to negotiate with the lowest bidder, and it's necessary then to identify who that is. And it's not just the price in the bid. You have to here add on the capitalized reservations that might be made in the offer from the contractor. So it may be said that the price of the offer is the contractor's requirements in connection with the execution of the work, whereas the tender price, which is the one we will look at in order to find the lowest price, is the client's cost of having the work carried out. So that is the tender cost plus the price of these reservations made in the offer. Three main categories of reservations: standard reservations drawn up by the organizations. Then we have joint reservations, which are drawn up by several contractors jointly. And finally, individual reservations from the individual contractor. Reservations will most often concern some of the conditions in the tender material, in the basis for the tender. Something which the contractor is not satisfied with, you might say, and he can then put in reservations in his offer. This, of course, he runs the risk of his offer being disqualified because of this, because, of course, the whole idea is that the tender material shouldn't be changed in any way, that the offer must reflect the tender or the tender material. Otherwise, also the whole process won't be fair in a certain way. But when it's the most advantageous offer, then the client is allowed to negotiate with a maximum of 3 tenderers who have submitted these potentially most advantageous offers. So he will then enter into negotiations, and this is, I believe, the most used way of offering tenders in Denmark for the time being, because it makes room for these negotiations, And of course, during these negotiations, maybe you can pressure the price further, and so on and so forth. So in the negotiations is about finding out how viable these projects are, and how viable the economic gains by these additional questions taken into the equations, how viable they are. So of course they must all be treated equally during this process, as always. Framework agreements are agreements about future works, so it's really an option. It is like a municipality, they will maybe make a bid or request offers for painting jobs on the schools in the northern part of the city or something, defined for the foreseeable couple of years, up to 4 years, I think. And then they will receive offers which are then the future price is then stipulated in various ways, an hourly fee, and so on and so forth. So it's also, this is intended to put a pressure on the price, because of course it's very attractive for the contractor to get this kind of long-term contract with the municipality. This is also the kind of jobs where otherwise you might use the informal tenders. Painting job which has to be done here within the municipality at this kindergarten or this school or something, and then you can of course make this informal bid. But if you have already made a framework contract covering this, then you are barred from doing anything else, and you have to give the job to this contractor who has been awarded the framework contract. So of course the tenderer is obliged to notify all the tenderers who has submitted tenders of which agreement he has made regarding the award of the contract, including, if relevant, the reasons for cancelling the tender or obtaining new informal bids. So once he's made the decision, of course, this has to be announced, and he has to explain why he made the choice that he did. In a restricted tender with pre-qualification, he must, of course, inform whether the contract has been qualified, and if they haven't, he must justify why. So he's also obliged to notify the rejected contractors and to justify the selection. When he has carried out negotiations with the most advantageous model, then he must also inform all the parties who didn't win the contract why he made the decisions that he did. What are the relative advantages of the accepted offer? Once this is all carried out and he has awarded, or even if he has cancelled the tender, all the people involved in making the offers, they can complain about the decision made to the appeals board for tenders. And the appeal boards will then evaluate this. The appeal board, of course, is specialists and judges are in this appeal board. And this happens all the time because tendering actually is a very complicated thing. Board of Appeal can cancel a tender altogether, say this is cancelled, we go, and they can stop the work which has already commenced. And they can also reward compensation for the lost earnings of the contractors who has been neglected, you might say, who should have fairly won the contract but wasn't awarded after all. So this is the framework for awarding these contracts here below the 43 million, but as I said, more or less the same system above. And of course, again, this is only obligatory for the public sector. But in many large private projects, something similar will be used.